Wonderful. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Laura Downey with KACEE, and here today with Leslie from MEEA. And we're very excited to have you join us today for a session on advocacy for environmental education with Sarah Fodor. And Sarah is the Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations with the North American Association for Environmental Education, and our esteemed colleague. And we're super excited to have Sarah join us today and talk to us about advocacy for environmental education and what's going on new with the Biden administration. So I will stop sharing my screen so that Sarah can share hers. And welcome, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Give me a thumbs up if I successfully shared my screen. Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, it's really great to be here. Just before we dive in, I'll tell you what I'm hoping to cover, and hopefully it touches on some of the things that you're interested in. And if it doesn't, then feel free to pop in and ask questions or redirect our conversation towards what's going to be most helpful to you. But first, I was just going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about why I think it's really important for environmental educators to get involved with advocacy, and hopefully convince you that it is a worthwhile use of your time. And then I will share some of our current federal priorities in this particular new Congress and under the new administration. We're feeling really optimistic about some of the opportunities that are out there to really advance environmental education and environmental literacy. So I'll talk about some of those high-level priorities and then hone in on a couple of really specific opportunities, particularly around climate change education and opportunities to support outdoor learning, and get into a few of the details around the recent stimulus funds and how those might be able to be leveraged to support the kinds of work that you are all doing. And as I said at the beginning, my presentation, I'll try to go quickly, but let me know if I'm talking too fast, and save lots of time for questions and discussion. But if Laura and Leslie and others want to keep an eye on the chat box, I am happy to be interrupted. So we can hopefully have a good conversation.
Great. I'll watch the chat.
Thank you. So as I said, I want to talk just for a minute about why advocate. And perhaps this is really obvious to you, but I think so many times when we are doing our jobs as educators, that's what we're focused on. And we don't always think about, the role that we might play in actually advocating on behalf of the work that we do. And it is really important. And it's so it's really actually fairly easy. There are lots of different levels of engagement that you can participate in as an advocate. And I hope that you'll find that when you dip your toe into that water, that the water is warm and that it is a more welcoming experience than you might imagine. So obviously, whoops, trigger finger. The obvious answer to why advocate is to advance specific policies, right, and strategies. So you want something to happen, and so you're out there talking to decision makers who have the ability to make something happen or not happen. So, that is, yes, the straightforward reason why we engage in advocacy, to have a certain policy adopted or a strategy pursued. But there are actually a lot of other benefits to getting involved in advocacy that might not seem quite as obvious at the outset, and I'm going to just briefly touch on those. I think really importantly, especially at this time in this environment in which we're working, is to really advance equity. Advocacy, particularly around specific policies that have the potential for systemic impact and equitable impact, is so essential. We all know about incredible programs, and we all know about the tremendous impacts of environmental education and what a difference it can make. And I suspect that many of you are doing that work every day, but we also know that far too few students and communities have access to those programs. And so a huge part of why I got involved in, focusing on policy and getting involved in trying to push policies that would support environmental education across the board, is because we want those exceptional examples to be the norm for everyone. Whoops, boy, I'm speeding through this. The other thing about advocacy is that it's a true opportunity to build relationships that can pay off in ways that you might not imagine when you first get started. And so I don't know if any of you recognize any of the women in this particular photograph, but this is 5 of the women in this photo are leaders at NAAEE affiliate organizations like MEEA and KACEE, who spent a day on the Hill in DC in 2019, right after midterm elections had taken place, and there were new members of Congress who were getting settled into their offices, and their staff, and in some cases, the representatives themselves, were open to meeting with these affiliate leaders to talk about environmental education. And this, of course, is then Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who was just recently confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior. And she was representing a congressional district in New Mexico. And on, let's see, in the photo, it's my left, is the executive director of the New Mexico Environmental Education Association. And here she went to welcome this new member of Congress and to talk to her about environmental education programs in New Mexico. And she secured a champion for environmental ed in New Mexico. And now this person has incredible power and influence over an entire agency that directs dollars across the country to supporting all kinds of things, but including several education programs. And so, you don't really know at the local and state level where, the relationships that you might forge will go eventually. And so having those relationships at the ground floor level can really make a huge difference to you personally and to your organization. And along the same lines, becoming involved in advocacy is just a way for us as professionals to elevate the profile of our work and of our own organizations. You would be surprised at how many times being a voice at the table automatically establishes sort of street cred for you by showing up, by reaching out, by expressing your opinion. You often garner attention that you might not have realized you would garner. And it really helps to professionalize the field of environmental education and establish us as seasoned professionals who have a level of expertise that is worth listening to. And I can't tell you the number of times that an organization gets involved in advocacy, and before they know it, they're being recognized and actually tapped as a resource because you have access to information that your legislators just don't have access to in terms of what programs are having a positive impact on the ground, or what are the needs of a particular population in your state or region. And you have really valuable information. And they don't know what they don't know. And so until you sort of approach them with some of this really valuable information, they could be completely oblivious to programs that they may be making funding or other types of decisions about without realizing kind of how they're impacting their own constituents, if that makes sense. So that's all just to say that really there isn't anybody that's better positioned than you to do this work. You have the firsthand stories of impact. You have often very local connections and can demonstrate for legislators, whether it's at the state or the federal level, how some of the decisions they're making have impact on the ground. And again, you are a knowledgeable voice. You are a passionate voice. It's very easy, I think, for us, again, in our day-to-day work to assume that somebody else is doing the advocacy work and that somebody else is sort of watching what's going on. And we try, right? But the reality is that in the field of environmental education, there just isn't that much capacity for doing advocacy like on a full-time basis. And so we really rely on each other as a community to do this work together, to amplify our voices by working together. And you know, it's really fine for me. I live in Maryland. I work for a DC-based organization. In pre-COVID times, I, you know, go up on the Hill and have these meetings, and I try to represent what's happening out in the States as best I can. But to be honest, you know, many members of Congress aren't particularly interested what some DC-based organization has to say. They really want to hear from the programs that are impacted at the state and local level. So again, some of this is like obvious, but I just want to, you know, from our standpoint, the type of advocacy that we engage in is really pretty simple stuff. It usually involves phone calls or emails to the legislators directly, more often to their staff. And developing relationships with staff can be just as valuable as developing relationships with the actually the elected official. Sometimes it involves meetings with those decision makers, and we are talking about decision makers of all stripes. And then, you know, mobilizing others. So sometimes there's a very targeted one-on-one thing that you can accomplish with just that simple phone call or email. And sometimes they need to hear from numbers of folks. And so mobilizing your community can be an important part of advocacy. And then special events can actually serve as a great forum for advocacy. So hosting a roundtable, inviting decision makers to your events, inviting them to listen in on, you know, community-based discussions and listening sessions, even inviting them to participate in, you know, watching a program in action. And maybe some of you have done this, inviting someone to come to see a field trip, inviting them to see a green school, inviting them to, you know, visit a program and see what's happening in real time is powerful stuff. Obviously, those kinds of opportunities have been a little bit challenged over the last several months and year, but when we start to get back to normal, you know, decision makers really, really love to have themselves photographed in some of these environments. And that can, again, be a way of really forging that relationship and really putting your organization's kind of stamp in their mind as a resource. So I'm not going to get in so much to kind of like the advocacy 101 that I sometimes do, but I am going to just say that here's the basic. If you haven't done this exercise before, I would really encourage you to do this as sort of an entry-level step to knowing who your representatives are. And this is completely applicable for your federal representatives as well as your state representatives. But you know, we had fairly recently an election, so there may be changes in who represents you. Finding out who they are, essential to know what their party affiliation is, because we all know that that matters in terms of how legislators think about issues. Particularly insightful to know what committee assignments they're on. And this is something that I'm happy to talk more about if people have questions, but you know, there are committees for everything in Congress, and different committees have different jurisdiction over particular issues. And so committees that deal with education, committees that deal with the environment are often the types of committees that we're mostly interested in. Of course, we focus really heavily on the appropriations committees. So those committees that get to make decisions about what goes into the federal budget. And if you have representatives on those key committees, then your involvement in advocacy at the federal level is especially helpful to the field. And then lastly, taking some time to just probe a little bit online even about what do your representatives care about. So sometimes you might be really surprised to find little facts and anecdotes about your representatives that might tell you something about how to engage them in a particular issue or a particular topic. You know, even those who you might think are not natural allies to our work may have experiences or relationships in their own background that would actually make them more open to our issues than you would think. I'm just going to take a quick pause. I know you're looking at the chat, but okay.
No questions so far, Sarah. So it looks like
Okay.
I have a question for you, though. So in your opinion, is Is it best to invite somebody to an event first or to go and visit them first so that they know who you are?
That's a really great question. I would say that it can work either way. There isn't a hard and fast rule, but I think a meeting or a visit is an excellent opportunity to extend that invitation. And so, I mean, really, I have almost always in a meeting, particularly with someone who doesn't know us that well or who doesn't have a really strong engagement with the EE community already, will almost always end a meeting by suggesting that if they are ever looking for, you know, an opportunity for the congressman to engage with a group of students, for example, we almost always extend that invitation in a general way. Oftentimes, it seems cliche, but you know, Earth Day's coming up, and they are often looking for a photo op on or around Earth Day. And if you have something that you can offer, this year's a little weird, but something that you can offer that's relatively easy for them to participate in, that's a great time of year. The other thing I'll just say is that we've seen really great success also with some of our, some folks in our network getting members of Congress to record short video welcomes for events that they maybe can't attend in person. But they're often happy to record something short, but that's also another way to engage. All right, I'm gonna keep skipping a slide every time. So we'll just keep taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Just be aware that we have a lot of tools available particularly for federal advocacy, and we can send out links to these resources, but there is an EE Pro group. You may not be familiar with our EE Pro platform, but it is on the NAAEE website, and it is a place where there are a lot of affinity groups that you can participate in conversation and read blogs and access resources specific to a particular topic under the broad EE umbrella. I mean, we do have an advocacy, policy, and civic engagement group. We host monthly advocacy calls with members of that group. So if that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to join that group and join us for future calls, or even just be in the group so that you can access resources after the fact. I mentioned the monthly advocacy calls, and then I'll talk briefly about our legislative priorities and appropriations, but we also once you're in that EE Pro group, you get action alerts and talking points and things like that when it's time to actually reach out. We do have a spreadsheet that you can use to figure out, did your senator or representative ever support environmental education in the past, which is a really great hint as to whether they're likely to do so in the future. And then more recently, we have developed a toolkit for advocacy, which goes into kind of some of the nuts and bolts of setting up meetings and some tips for having a really successful meeting, and gives you some ideas about, again, some of that outside of specific policy asks. How do you engage and build relationships with decision maker offices? Okay, so what are we focused on in the Biden administration and in the 117th Congress? There is a ton going on. I mean, it is so awesome and so exciting, but I have to tell you that since the election results were finalized, it's been a bit overwhelming, because it seems like there's been new announcements every day, every week, that are relevant to the field of environmental education, particularly around climate change. We can talk about that in just a little bit. But historically, our work has focused on the annual appropriations process. So there are a couple of grant programs at EPA and at NOAA. You may have been a recipient of environmental ed grants through EPA. There are environmental literacy grants and Bay Watershed Education and Training grants at NOAA that really are relatively small programs in terms of the overall federal budget, but they are regularly put on the chopping block for elimination or for severe cuts. I mean, I will say that those cuts tend to come from bipartisan directions. It is not one party or another that tends to want to cut those programs. I think that's from a lack of understanding of the effect and impact of those programs. And we have been successful year over year in engaging members of Congress to say, please maintain funding for these programs. And so while administrative budgets might propose eliminating them, Congress always sustains them. This year, we're asking for pretty significant boosts in funding for those programs. We might not get everything we're asking for, but we figure we might as well ask for increases. If you saw the Biden administration's budget outline that came out on Friday, you know that they are actually recommending significant increases for a number of agencies. And we don't have the details yet on where our program priorities fall within those increases, but we're really cautiously optimistic that we're going to not only maintain funding for those programs, but actually get more funding in the fiscal year 22 budget. So aside from that appropriations work, which, as I said, has been our bread and butter for eons, we're really branching out. We are looking at climate change education through a number of lenses, and I'll talk about some of those lenses in a few slides, but there is one specific piece of legislation that we're focusing on around climate change education, which would set up a grant program at NOAA to support, education for students, professional development for teachers, grants to community-based organizations and nonprofits for climate change education. But we know that as the Biden administration has committed to this whole of government approach to climate change, that there are going to be opportunities across the board to try to say, hey, don't forget about the education piece of this. Addressing climate change is, yes, it's going to take technology, it's going to take, science and regulation, but it's also going to take, education and community outreach and all kinds of sort of non-formal, non-regulatory approaches to not just prepare communities for the policy changes that are likely coming around climate change, but also prepare students to really thrive in a clean and green economy. Next, we are very excited about the opportunity to support a No Child Left Inside Act. This is a reprisal of a bill that was first introduced over 10 years ago, and it is meant to bolster support for environmental education at the Department of Education. It would incentivize the development and implementation of statewide environmental literacy plans. It would provide grants to school districts to do a wide range of relevant environmental education activities. It also, this new iteration includes funding for a national pilot program for outdoor school models. And we are really hopeful that it is going to be introduced in a bipartisan manner, at least in the Senate. We are working really hard on that. And we are also hopeful that that bill is going to be introduced just before or potentially on Earth Day. So it's really coming super soon. And that's going to be an exciting piece of legislation to rally around. And then we are also looking at possibly, with this being a new administration and a new Congress, the opportunity to reauthorize the National Environmental Education Act. It is a bill that has not been reauthorized since 1990. So you can imagine that even just the language in it is super dusty. And it really needs to be modernized and really reflect the field as it is today. But just so you know, the National Environmental Education Act is the bill that established the Office of Environmental Education at EPA and actually created the regional environmental education grants and the national capacity building grant that the field has engaged with since it was first passed. And then lastly on our priorities list is sort of taking a broad look at infrastructure funding for schools. Particularly, there's a Reopen and Rebuild America's Schools Act, which would provide a historic federal investment in modernizing school facilities. And it now includes some language that references the outdoor spaces as part of school facilities. But I think for Kansas and Missouri, also important to recognize that it includes a number of elements that are key to green schools programs. So a lot of sort of standards and expectations for sustainable features, and potentially, you know, an opportunity to connect teaching and learning to the operation of school buildings. However, we know that as like the Biden administration has introduced their framework for an infrastructure plan, and there's this broad talk about infrastructure as kind of like a stimulus program, it's really looking like there are a number of ways in which that particular bill might just get embedded into some other sort of bigger package. And so we're maintaining a certain level of flexibility in that we want money for school facilities, whether that's the money that was just passed for the American Recovery Plan, whether it's the Rebuild America Schools Act, or whether it's some other big package, as long as there's a certain threshold of funding and some key provisions will be supportive of infrastructure money for schools. Okay, dokie. Okay, just to drill down on the climate change piece for just a minute. As I said, there's this whole of government approach that the Biden administration has taken. There is a federal task force on climate change that involves representatives of, I think at this point, every agency. Initially, the Department of Education was not included in that task force, but there were a number of groups that reached out and said, hey, Department of Ed needs to be part of this conversation as well. And when they had their first meeting, I think in February, Department of Education was in fact represented on that task force. So again, our position sort of broadly is to say education is a key component of any comprehensive effort to address climate change. And we advocate that federally. We also support our affiliates and others in advocating that at the state level. There is also, I mean, we could get into the weeds, and so I'll try to not do that here. But as we rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, there was something called the ACE, which in this case, there's a lot of ACEs out there, but in this case, it stands for Action for Climate Empowerment. I almost got that wrong, but Action for Climate Empowerment Strategic Framework, which is kind of like a framework for what's the community engagement piece of the US work under the Paris Climate Agreement. And so we've been sort of supporting that in a conceptual way. Again, this idea that there's not just a government role, but there's a community role, there's an educator role in dealing with climate change. Related to that, there's this thing that will be announced on Earth Day called the Nationally Determined Contributions. And that's when the US is going to actually say, here's how much carbon we are going to reduce by when and from which sources. There are a number of organizations that have been urging that K-12 schools be part of that modeling. So like, how much carbon could you reduce if we switch to all electric bus fleets? How much carbon could be reduced if we upgraded school facilities to a certain standard? You know, how can school grounds become sources of carbon reduction? And so there's an effort underway there. There is this Climate Change Education Act that again would establish a grant program at NOAA. That was recently introduced. And so we'll see where that might go. Tons going on to try to really like take a look at the intersection between environmental education and climate justice. And we're seeing, particularly at the state level, renewed efforts to embed not just climate change education, but climate justice education into the curriculum. And then to sort of try to wrap some of these efforts together, we have just launched a new coalition for climate education policy. And after I am done sharing my screen, I can drop a link to that coalition website into the chat box. And I would encourage anyone who's interested there's a super simple Google form if your organization is interested in joining that coalition. It's brand new. And we are going to have our first coalition-wide, conference call probably in the next 3 weeks. All right, I'm going to try to go more quickly here. Many of you may have seen this document that Laura actually was a real champion for back in the summer. Laura and several of her colleagues from other parts of the country really looked at the issue of reopening schools and the role that environmental education programs could play in both supporting virtual learning, as many of you have been doing, but also in partnering to facilitate outdoor classrooms, outdoor learning, in some cases potentially open up off-site spaces to allow for additional physical capacity for schools. And we've seen a number of really great examples of that around the country. And so this was a really collaborative effort across many states to put this high-level document together. And then several states, and I apologize that my collage here is kind of messy to look at, but states like Kansas then took that sort of high-level document and really customized it for the context on the ground, because we know that, while we were all experiencing the pandemic in some ways together, that the way it was playing out, for communities and schools was different depending on where in the country you are, and based on a number of circumstances. And so this is an example of a recent update that's really focused on creating outdoor classrooms that Laura and her team put together. There was the sort of original guidance document and links to resources that many affiliate organizations put together. And then down here in the bottom corner is just a screenshot of a guide to advocacy for outdoor classrooms that I partnered with colleagues at the National Wildlife Federation to kind of try to compile a whole bunch of resources into one place and give some tips for reaching out at the local level to try to bolster support for outdoor classrooms in the reopening strategies. Okay. So on that front, though, the good news is that there is actually a ton of funding to support education broadly. So I don't want to ever minimize the challenges that schools are facing to give the impression that everybody should just do EE to solve every problem. But, there is a lot of money that has been flowing to schools. And here's just sort of the timeline of that funding. Last spring through CARES, that the ESSER, by the way, I should say, is elementary and secondary. I can't remember what it stands for, but basically it's emergency relief funding for elementary and secondary schools. So these are the amounts of money through each of the stimulus relief bills that have flown to the states. With the largest most recently being the bill that passed just in March. And so I'm of the mindset, to be honest, that this money is going to shape what all of us are doing in the education space for the next few years, because I think it's going to have such a profound impact. Well, at least for those of us who work with schools as a primary audience, I think that this money is going to impact how schools function, and therefore is going to impact what they need and want from their community-based partners. So here is another depiction of this. I don't want to take any credit for this chart. It comes from the National Council for School Facilities. But this also shows what was the total appropriation, what amount of that was allocated for, pre-K through 12 education. And then I think somewhat importantly, of each state allocation, what % is required to be passed on to the local education agencies. And then I think it's interesting and worth noting the timeline on which they have to spend that funding, because I think it's really easy to think like, okay, they got that money's over and done with, but it's not. In many cases, the planning and thinking about how this funding should be used is happening and will be going on for some time. I think, and this is just me with my gut, and I'm sure there may be folks here who have much better sense of this than I do, so take it with a grain of salt. I think this summer is going to be a pretty important time for engaging with your school partners about what they might be thinking for next year and beyond. And a really important note is that down here, where the American Rescue Plan has been passed, and this $122 billion that's supposed to be allocated to schools, I think about 81 billion has already been distributed. They have a deadline of September 30th, 2023 to spend that. However, I don't understand this at all myself, but there was some amendment that was added at the end that sticks an extra year on that. And so for whatever reason, they still say the deadline is September 30th, 2023, but you really have until September 30th, 2024 to spend that money. So again, that's why I say, I think that like the impact of this funding is not, you know, this really super short-term thing that goes away after just one school year. Okay, so the reason why I have this blank screen is because I tried to get clever about what I wanted to just share with you next, which is that, you know, I recently listened in on a U.S. Department of Education summit about reopening schools. And there were a number of school district leaders who sat on panels and really talked about what their plans for the future were and how they were going to basically take some of what they'd learned through the COVID and really try to apply that to their plans for schools going forward. And I was really inspired and compelled by what some of these district leaders said. And I wanted to just share a couple of the things that they were talking about. I heard them talking about project-based learning. They were talking about how they were going to really focus on their students' social emotional learning. They said, we are going to tap every asset in our community. They talked about more student voice and choice. They talked about engaging their non-formal partners. They said that they were going to get really serious about the role of out of school time for addressing learning loss and continuing to support students and families. And finally, daggone it, they said, we are going to be bold. They specifically talked about using their most recent stimulus money to support partnerships with their community-based organizations. And they said they want to be bold. Now, granted, that's a sampling of school district leaders who obviously got picked to be on that panel because they had some vision and something to say. But I have actually scheduled a follow-up conversation with one of those school leaders because I want to know more about what can we in the non-formal community be doing to position ourselves to be the best partners we can possibly be in the next few years. So I'm just going to wrap up to say that, you know, there's a lot more we could talk about, but the takeaway for me right now is that we are in an era of an unprecedented focus on climate change, and you can tell that it is real and sincere. We have not had a single conversation with anyone even remotely associated with the administration where it is not clear that climate change is not just a priority in word, it is a priority, and they're going to do things on climate change. Similarly, we're looking at historic investments in K-12 schools, you know, much of which is focused on getting us past this terrible time that we've been in and the impacts of that on our students and families. But really, I think also looking to the future to say, how do we make sure, for example, that our facilities are adequate, that we are not trying to figure out how to send kids back to schools that don't have appropriate ventilation, for heaven's sake, and what can outdoor spaces look like to not just provide capacity for learning, but help students deal with trauma, address their social emotional learning, provide really authentic, spaces for meaningful learning. And as I said before, it's just my sense that some of this funding is really going to have an impact for years to come. And for all of those reasons, now is just an incredible time to engage locally regionally, at the state level, at whatever scale you are operating or feel most comfortable. This is really a great time to strengthen those partnerships that I'm sure many of you already have with the formal education system. And many of you Mrs. Walker is in the formal education system. I can't see everybody at once, so I'm sure that there are other classroom teachers. So that's really what I put together to talk about. I urge you, you're obviously all fans, but, stay connected to KACEE and MEEA for, further updates. And because whatever, I learn at NAAEE, I'm always sharing out to Laura and Leslie and our colleagues, and we will continue to do that as we find out more about federal budget, stimulus funding, anything we know about timelines, and we would encourage you to share anything that you might learn with us as well. So I'm just happy to chat if there are questions or anything that we didn't cover that it would be helpful to talk about.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was awesome. And of course, we would also love to hear in the reverse too about what we can do to support you in your outreach and advocacy efforts. And if there are some, the e-guidance that Sarah referenced, those are tools that we're working on to supply to you so that you can have what you need to reach out to your local school partners in this. So are there any questions or comments or things that you're wondering about that Sarah can maybe discuss with you?
Laura, I have a question.
Go.
As a classroom teacher, where could I put like one focus that would make a big impact or a difference? Because I wouldn't be able to spread myself out, but what could I do? Like one thing.
That was you, Lenore, right? I recognize your voice. Yes, thank you, Lenore. All right, Sarah, what as a classroom teacher would be the one thing or the impact that Lenore could make?
That's such a great question. And in some ways I would, I think in some ways it depends on what you feel like you need most, but I think kind of being an advocate at your school for whichever piece of any of this you think would be most valuable to you and to your students. So whether it's particular professional development, whether it's particular experiences for your students, whether it's some additional resources that would make it easier for you to integrate environmental education or outdoor learning. What I have found is that there's so much going on. And in particular, some of these bills are so vast that even district leaders don't know what they're even allowed to spend money on. So, advocating in some ways on behalf of your own classroom and letting decision makers know that it is perfectly acceptable to spend funding on all of those things. I should have said the money that has come through these stimulus packages is intentionally so flexible. I mean, it literally says you can use any of this funding for anything that's already allowed under existing education law. So it might be a chance to do more of something that you're already doing, but it's also, but there's also a lot of ways to talk about the work that you do to address learning loss, for example, and how important maybe engaging with out of school time partners might be. There's just tremendous flexibility, but I think helping connect some of those dots for whether it's your principal or someone at your district level is potentially one of the most powerful things you can do for your school.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, the spending is pretty wide open from what I've read. Yes, that anything from creating outdoor classrooms is a possibility, to professional learning for the teachers is a possibility, to offsite learning at facilities is a possibility, summer learning, after school learning, anything that supports social health and well-being. All of those types of things are possibilities. And that may be like, I know that Sarah, we've talked about potentially working on sort of some documentation that would put something in your hands to be able to say, these are the kinds of things that are possible.
Yep. Yeah. And I will also just add, I didn't do a deep dive yet, but it's on my list that, Department of Education just issued some additional guidance around things like, well, not just reopening schools, but planning for the future. And I was actually really pleasantly surprised that, in terms of thinking about addressing learning loss and providing additional enrichment for students, field trips was actually specifically recommended as one of the components that schools should think about. And I fully cynically thought, oh man, we're not going to see the return of the field trip for years, and maybe that will be the case, but I thought it was really great. It's great to have something in writing from the Department of Ed that says these are some of the things you actually should be doing for your students.
Any other questions or items you'd like to bring up for discussion?
I am not super involved, and so I'm sure you probably have something offered out that I may have missed or am unaware of. But do you guys ever do like a share out of resources, or let's say we want to get involved in grant writing for some different things that we are having in our mind that we want to do, like sensory gardens and things like that? How do we even get started, or where do we look? Like, I've looked online, I found a couple different things. Do you guys ever do just an hour-long session of, hey, here's all these resources for this particular thing, or this one?
That's a great question. Laura, do you have something?
Well, I was just going to say, so Mrs. Walker, that was you, right? I think I was following who was talking. So I know that the North American Association for Environmental Education does webinars on a monthly basis on a lot of different topics. And that to me is like a fabulous resource. And then Leslie, this virtual monthly event was Leslie's brainstorm, but KACEE is happy to be working with the Missouri Association to do this. So we're always looking for new topics as well, of things that would be of interest to you. And so if there's, if that's something that's on your mind, that's something we can certainly look into for sure.
Yeah, when Sarah was talking, one idea that came to me was that this would be a great opportunity to find out, to survey our membership, and maybe KACEE and MEEA could work together on that to kind of guide and change up some of our virtual monthly events, even to address, or just even to send out to our members fact sheets on, if you're interested in grants for X, Y, or Z, here's where to go. Yeah, it's a great question.
That would be awesome. I saw the one about the milkweed, and we have a butterfly garden here, so I already was aware of that one, but just I've looked at a greenhouse or different things, and to have the space and know what to write, the capacity to do that, and where all I could be looking, because we would be starting from the ground up. It's not like we have anything here already for outdoor learning space. So how to even get started, the maintenance of it, who does that? Is that our maintenance department who does that? Just summer type things, all of the above. So just curious. Thank you.
That is certainly something that you could advocate to your school administration to say, this is how I would like to see our school in part address, as Sarah said, you frame it within learning loss or expanding learning opportunities, social and mental well-being. What are some other ways, Sarah, to frame that?
I've seen, now policies vary, so this doesn't work everywhere, but I've seen some really great advocacy around using outdoor learning spaces as an opportunity for students to take a mask break if masks are required at your school. You know, obviously that sometimes means facilitating in smaller groups, but I've seen a number of cases where there's considered a win-win in doing some outdoor activities for that reason. As I said, there's this real, I think, push and recognition that having more sort of experiential learning is going to be one of the ways that schools are looking to address learning loss. And so talking about things like the garden and the greenhouse as, I mean, absolutely being that experiential learning.
So Sarah, I'm going to ask a really basic question here, thinking about teachers that might want to advocate to their school leadership. So the ESSER funding, the emergency funding, I mean, that was distributed across the board to schools. So all schools have received some. And so they are just asking their administrators to allocate it for certain things and sharing with them that things are allowable that they might not realize are allowable?
So every district or every LEA has received funding. What their timeline for actual dissemination to schools looks like is a little unclear to me. I know that there are some like planning recommendations that folks like the National Council for School Facilities has put together to try to help LEAs kind of make assessments of what some of their more focused like brick and mortar facilities needs might be. But that's just a piece of that pie. I'm not giving a very good answer, except to say that I think there is an opportunity when individual schools and LEAs are having conversations about what are the strategies we're going to implement to address learning loss, what are the strategies we're going to implement to address social emotional learning. I think that that's when you can really start to have some of those conversations about, particularly if it's something that you've been working towards already, and now this is an opportunity to really greatly accelerate that, or to, you know, really actually put some money behind something that had been perhaps well-intentioned but under-resourced in the past. I do know that aside from the ESSER funding, there's also been funding through these stimulus packages that have gone directly to states, in which governors' offices have sometimes issued separate grant opportunities. Thinking about in Maine, for example, there was a separate funding opportunity that just said, we're going to offer money for you to innovate in the light of COVID. And the state of Maine put together like 5 innovations, and they put outdoor learning in as one of them. And so they received funding to provide professional development and do a number of other things that just would support teachers in their confidence and capacity to integrate outdoor learning into the school day. So there are a number of ways of potentially approaching access to some of this money. But I will say that that's part of, so like in terms of this kind of two-way feeding of information, that's the challenge for me looking at a national level, is like, I have the perspective that, okay, there's this money, you know, and here's kind of the pathway for that funding. But I'm keenly aware that what actually happens with that money and how it gets advocated for is in some ways hyper local. And so, I mean, Laura and I talk about this a lot. It's sort of like, what's the, you know, what needs to happen in the space between, you know, a dump of federal funding and these local programs and partnerships. And it's not a one pager, unfortunately. It's a little bit, it's about relationships, I think, in many ways.
And the first step to having a relationship is having a conversation, for sure. And so Even if you feel like you don't know exactly what you're talking about, just start talking about it. Help me understand at the local level, how are these funds potentially being used, and who gets to have some say or some input, because I have some ideas I'd love to share. I mean, that's the way to start the conversation. And we will continue to work on resources for sure. I think we maybe have one more time for one more quick question, if there is one. There's been some great resources that I threw everything that you were talking about, I hope, Sarah, into the chat. Oh yeah, and so John's also mentioning the framing guide that was put out by Colorado and New Mexico.
Yep, great. Thank you for reminding us of that.
So the framing guide is really about ways to do messaging in ways that you don't stop the conversation before it starts, where you win friends and gain influence by making sure you're using language choices that work. So, well, I think I don't know if we have any other questions, but we really do certainly want to thank you, Sarah, very much for sharing your enormous expertise in this area with something that can seem a little intimidating, but is really just talking to people, and encouraging us to do that and to take advantage of the many, many, many opportunities there are to advance environmental education in outdoor classrooms and outdoor learning, and partnerships with non-formal educators in our states. And connect with KACEE and MEEA, and we will keep you posted and up to date. Connect with eePro on the North American Association for Environmental Education's website for their advocacy, so you can stay in touch with what's happening nationally as well. And anything else, Sarah, before we go?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all of you for the work that you do.